So many experts on the topic here today. I thought it would be interesting to have not just the academic paper presentations, but also a panel, maybe focus a bit more on the big picture, focus a bit more on policy. So I want to leave it to the panel to talk, and later there will be time for a question from you. So I'm just going to introduce them very, very briefly. Just to say the structure, so we're going to start with a short presentation from each of the panel members, and then there's time for questions from you, which I hope there will be many, and you can address them to the panel in general, to specific people. I should mention that the panel will be recorded and it will be put online, so if you ask your questions, please ask them loud and clearly, and be aware that they're going to be online. So let me introduce the panel. So the short presentations will be in a certain topical order, and then we realized that they're also in alphabetical order of last names, which makes it easier for me. So you're going to hear first from Andrew Aitken from the OECD, who you've already seen present. Then you're going to hear from Marie Connolly. Marie is a professor at the Department of Economics at UQAM, University du Québec à Montréal, and she's a specialist in inequality and in particular intergenerational mobility, about the topic about which we've also heard today. So we'll be happy to hear more. She'll be followed by Guy Lacroix, who's a professor at the Université Laval in Quebec City and has worked on many topics associated to inequality very broadly. And finally, we're going to have again Joana Silva, who's kicked off the day, right? And you're going to be the
first and last.
But then the questions after that. Okay, so I'm going to shut up now, and I'll take it over to you. So, Andrew, the technology dictates that you present from there, but you have the clicker, so you're in control.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Okay, so I'll just go. I mean, I've just got a few slides. I'll go through these fairly quickly. I mean, some of it's really just repeating what I've already said, really. But I mean, obviously, life expectancy is increasing. This just shows you actually both what's happening to life expectancy, which is the lines above the horizontal line there, and this is gains in life expectancy, as I said, at age 65. So this is the longevity transition that we're dealing with in many OECD countries. And then below the horizontal line there is the average age of labour market exit. But actually, this shows you that actually, although since the sort of mid-2000s, average age of labour market exit has increased, it's still below what it was in 1975 on average across OECD countries. And so there isn't, so with life expectancy, increase in life expectancy obviously comes concerns about health in older age, and also gaps in life expectancy between different skill groups, for example. So this just shows you that actually there doesn't seem to be any particular international trend in the evolution of the educational gap in life expectancy. So this is just showing the gap in life expectancy between high skilled and low skilled. And so the average is in the middle there, roughly. So there isn't really any change either for men or women. In some countries on the left-hand side there, like Estonia, Greece, Poland, there's actually been an improvement. This gap between the high educated and low educated has actually improved. Whereas over on the right-hand side, countries like Slovak Republic, United States, Germany, actually this gap does seem to be increasing. So that's obviously something that we might want to be concerned about. So I mean, I already said this earlier, but I didn't show you this graph, but this just shows you pretty dramatically the increase in employment rates of older ages. So the bars are showing the 55 to 64, and the diamonds are showing the 65 to 69. So substantial increases in employment rates, but as I said, still below the rates that on average that existed in 1975. So just thinking about poverty rates, I mean, looking at what's happening in terms of income inequality, consumption inequality, wealth inequality. It's we haven't been particularly looking at these sort of outcomes in the work that we've been doing at the moment, but this comes from the pensions team, and this just shows you what's happening for workers in terms of poverty rates for the population aged over 65 versus the total population. So you can see that in the majority of OECD countries, the old are more likely to be poor than the average. And then this just shows you what's happening to average income inequality, which again, looking at these household equalized income data, hasn't really changed since 2000 on average across the OECD, which is it's sort of shown in the middle there, OECD 32. But again, there's big differences across countries. So there's been some declines in the Gini coefficient, and obviously some increases at the right-hand side in New Zealand, Denmark, Sweden. So for age group, age 65 plus. So another issue is that obviously employment rates for women still lag behind those for men. So this is particularly concerning because this is one of the factors that's going to result in large gaps in pension income. So this is just showing the relative difference between men and women aged 65 plus in terms of pension income. So you can see there's really huge gap in Japan, Mexico, Netherlands on the left-hand side, 40 up to almost 50% gap in the pension income between men and women. This is just some simulation work that we've done, which just shows you that how longer working lives can boost living standards. So there's actually 3 different simulations here, but the green bars are showing what would happen for what's called keeping up with the Joneses here. So if employment rates across all of these OECD countries were to reach the levels that you see in countries such as New Zealand, Iceland, which have the highest employment rates for older workers. So and then just very quickly, 3 last slides here, just to flag some other issues. Is just that inequalities in career trajectories do start early in life. So this is looking at the effects of the evolution of the firm wage premium. So the firm wage premium is just the portion of wages that's due to the characteristics of the firm, that's so abstracting from the composition of the workforce. And so this is showing what happens for men over time with primary education versus secondary or tertiary education, and also for women. And this at the moment, this has just been done for Portugal. And I mean, I know there's a big literature on this. So again, the fact that these inequalities start early in life just emphasizes the point that we need to really think about a life cycle perspective when we're thinking about policies. And I mean, this has already been mentioned, but obviously the costs of job displacement are really large for older workers. So we need to think, and there's big literature on the consequences of displacement and policies. I mean, there's to some extent there's not so much on actually older workers. I mean there's some, but often it seems to be a bit of an afterthought in this literature. So that's another area where we need to think about. And finally, just to flag AI. So I mean, this is the big thing that's obviously here and coming around the corner. This comes from colleagues who have done a survey, AI surveys amongst both employees and employers. This one comes from results from employers. I just want to draw your attention to the top 2 bars there, so that the panel A is in financial insurance and panel B is in manufacturing. But where employers think that harm might be the most significant is amongst older workers and low-skilled workers. But then they do think that at the very bottom there, workers with disabilities, that AI could actually help workers with disabilities. I mean, there's obviously work ongoing at the OECD and other places in terms of the actual impact, but just use that to flag the issue of AI in terms of what we need to be thinking about in the future. That's it from me.
All right, so while we get my slides up, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to stand in place, but so that way I can see the screen a little bit better, because I don't remember all my slides by heart. So thank you for the organizers for inviting me to be on this roundtable. I know it's the end of the day. We've had a long day with many really great presentations. And so here's me. maybe? Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. Are we good? Okay, we're good. I'm Marie Connolly. As mentioned, I'm at University of Quebec in Montreal. And I'll say thanks to the funders and I'm going to show you 3 results, 2 of which are coming from analysis that was done using StatsCan data at the RDC. And I should tell you that those analyses were done in the lab, and they're my opinion, but we've got many generous funders. All right, so inequality and equality of opportunity. So the theme of this workshop was inequality. The work that I've done has mostly been on intergenerational mobility. And the reason why I think this is important, and I think there's a quote, an opening quote missing at the beginning of this slide. This is all a quote from a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives by Guy Lacroix in 2013. Just mentioned this is not what I wrote, but I firmly agree with what's written here. And what's the relationship between inequality and equality of opportunity? And inequality lowers mobility because it shapes opportunity. Also, it heightens the income consequences of innate differences between individuals, and it changes opportunities, incentives, and institutions that form, develop, and transmit characteristics and skills valued in the labor market. It shifts balance of power so that some groups are in a position to structure policies or otherwise support their children's achievement independent of talent. And I think this sort of weaves together different themes that we've seen today, from the presentation on the parental investments, looking at the PISA scores, to others looking at wealth inequality over time, and different presentations that we've seen. So I think this is an important point to keep in mind. Also, I'll keep going for those of you in the back that can't see very well because it's far. Thus, those who are concerned about equality of opportunity should also care about inequality of outcomes, but only to the extent that these differences in outcomes are due, in the words of John Romer, to differential circumstances. And my main point here, I reiterate that is from Miles Correct, is that deciding which circumstances should be offset by policy steps of some kind, and as a result, the fraction of parental income advantage passed on to children that is consistent with equality of opportunity, is a value judgment that different societies may well make differently. And also that's the link between a lot of presentations today. We're talking about policy choices, and the differences that we can observe comparing different countries. And I think there's no magical number in terms of a target of what degree of inequality, or for that matter, what degree of equality we want to attain as a society. And I think as an economist, I see my role as documenting what we observe based on best data that I can find. I'm very jealous of the Norwegian data, but that's another matter. So documenting, also investigating the different mechanisms and the different implication that different policies can have, evaluating different policies. But at some point, the answers to what that magic number is a value judgment that different societies may make differently. And that's why we observe differences that we do observe. And there's no, I mean, I can take a stance as an individual, but I think as an economist, I'm not there to make that decision. This is a collective decision that societies make differently. That being said, I'll show you a few results that I have. Here we're going to focus on Canada, because that's the data that I have access to. Our work is based on Statistics Canada's intergenerational income database. We've covered cohorts of Canadians born between 1963 and 1985. Those are administrative tax files. So it covers those cohorts and their parents for tax years from the late 70s to 2016, working on getting more tax years by now, but this covers about 6 million children. We measure parental income. This is just what I'm going to show you in the in papers, we, try all sort of different specifications, but where you're going to see parental income is measured as a five-year average when the child is aged 15 to 19. Child income is also a 5-year average. We're looking at different age groups. Different estimates that we can use are to look at the intergenerational transmission of income. You can look at log models where you explain the log child income in adulthood by the log of their parents' income. You can also look at rank models where you look at percentile ranks and you explain the child rank by the parent rank. You can also look at a quintile transition matrix, and so you separate both the parents and the children into 5 buckets, and you look at the transitions between those two. Okay, what we've observed, this is from a work that's just been published in 2024 with my colleague Catherine Hack in the Kane Journal of Economics. Here, what you see on the y-axis is the rank slope. And so if you look at the rank correlation, when you try to explain child income rank by parental income rank, the number that you observe. And on the x-axis, you see the child's birth year. So in Canada, as we've gone from the cohort of kids born in the early 60s to the cohort of kids born in the mid 80s, what we've seen is an increase in the rank slope. Here, increasing transmission means lower intergenerational mobility. So we've seen less mobility. Just to give you a perspective, the mobility in Canada is still relatively good if you compare it to the US or the UK or other places. It's also a similar pattern that we've seen in all the provinces across the country. But it's not a zero relationship, so there's still this relationship, and it's a transmission that has been increasing over the course that we've seen. Where is the action? The action is mostly for children whose parents were at the bottom of the income distribution. So another thing that you can see here on the similar graph, but on the on the y-axis, is the probability that a child is in the bottom income quintile for their distribution, given the parental income quintile. And I'm afraid, oh yeah, there it is. The dots here on the top shows the conditional probability to remain in the bottom income quintile when your parents were in the bottom income quintile. So this is the equivalent of, say, the poverty trap. You're staying in the same quintile, and this is where the action is, in the sense that this is the probability that's been rising, whereas for the other groups, it's stayed relatively similar. So what you see is a deterioration of outcomes for those at the very bottom of the parental income distribution. Another thing that's interesting, the work that we do, because we're looking at kids and we need to observe them when they're relatively old or old enough to be on the labor market, it's sort of semi-historical by nature. And so even in this graph, the youngest cohort is born in 1985. I'm older than that, so I consider that somewhat historical, but also the conditions into which these kids were growing up is for the kids in 1985, they were teenagers in the 90s all the way to 2000. And so when we look at their parents' income and the inequality in their parents' income distribution, we're looking mostly at this period here. On this graph, it's just the Gini coefficient for the adjusted total income in Canada. And this is similar to other countries. There's a large increase in inequality in the 90s, but sort of a leveling off, and even dips, even if you don't take into account 2020, sort of a trend going down in terms of inequality. So the question that I don't have an answer to, we'll need to wait a few more years to have more younger cohorts in our data sets. But this increase in intergenerational transmissions that we've seen before was corresponded to this time. So when we'll have kids that are born a little later that have experienced growing up in a time of decreasing income inequality, even though we're not quite reaching levels of the 60s and 70s. Well, will we see a reversal in intergenerational transmission trends? It's something that's we're going to need to think about. And lastly, second bullet point, mechanisms and policy levers are still relatively not well known, although I have to say people in this room are contributing with the research to understanding all the mechanisms and policy levers that we have access to if we want to promote intergenerational mobility. And I'm putting here some current work of mine. If you want to come talk to me later, some of the work that I'm doing, I look at intergenerational transmissions among second generation and 1.5 generation immigrants. I also look at the transmission of income, but different components of income, including estimates of wealth, which we don't have really good data on in Canada. And also computing an atlas of rank mobility in Canada at different geographical levels so that other researchers can use those numbers and don't have to go through the same steps as I did to access the data at the RDC. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just wait for my presentation to come up. So we talked about OECD, she talked about Canada, so I'll be talking about Quebec, perhaps Montreal.
The world.
World. Okay. I'll just wait a few minutes. Okay, there it is. Okay. Okay, little bird. Okay, thanks. So thanks again for the invitation. I'm pretty happy to be talking about this topic today. This is not a paper. This is current work. Something I'm doing right now. So it's a maternity or parental tax. And it was just mentioned that one of the problems in terms of inequality of income is the fact that mothers usually tend to earn less, and then they carry this for a very long time. And by the time they retire, they have lower incomes and lower pensions. So I got interested into this topic, and it's a really, really active research program. The papers coming out all the time. You have one. And so what I'll be doing here is try to motivate why I'm interested in focusing on Quebec in particular. So again, the child tax yields inequalities within households. And this is mainly driven by the fact that in the long run, women tend to work less, earn less, driven by lower participation rate and so on and so forth. And what the literature has shown is that the child tax has tended to increase through time. And it's even passed through from the mothers to the daughters. I mean, we've seen Abdel had something on this, and we've seen a few papers on this. Now it's going even further in terms of transmission toward the daughter in some sense. So what I want to point at is the fact that in Quebec is particular in North America. For those who are not from Canada or from North America, Quebec has introduced quite a few sweeping reforms in the 1990s. I'll just mention a few. We had the Pay Equity Act in 1996, Family Benefits Reform in 1997, subsidized childcare in Quebec, which is quite unique. Now we have a federal program that's being put in place, but it's inspired from what we did 20 years ago. Prescription drug insurance. The federal government is thinking about implementing this. We did that 20 years ago. And parental insurance program, which is more generous than anywhere else in Canada. So consequence of all this, well, as some sociologists have been mentioning, Quebec's distinctive policy models produce a growing dualism between Quebec and the rest of the country. We're definitely in a different ballgame in terms of policy. And the question I was asking myself, well, could this somehow impact the child tax penalty? So what you see in this graph is on the left-hand side, you have the employment rate for childbearing age women in Quebec and Ontario. And as you can see, up until 1997, the participation rate of women in Quebec, 25, 44 years of age, was much lower than what it was in Ontario. And by the time we introduced the subsidized daycare, the first dotted line you see, then women, the participation rate started to increase. And not only did it increase, but it's way above what it is now in the rest of Canada. And we have the highest participation rate. Women, childbearing age women now have the highest participation rate in North America, if not in OECD country. If you look at Canada, that's one thing. If you look at Quebec, we're way above the national average. And if you look at men, well, men had pretty much the same pattern as English men in the rest of Canada. And up until about 2005, that's when we introduced the parental leave program, which we have what we call a daddy leave, a daddy quota, a paternity leave, and which was introduced 20 years ago. And I'll be focusing on this today, just to show you what the impact might be. And I'm not going to make any causal relation between this because I'll be starting, my data starts at 2006. So conditional having the program in place. Let's look at the child tax in Quebec. So here you see the participation rates of men and women of 25 to 44 years of age in Quebec. And as of 2023, the difference between the participation rates of women and men is only 4 percentage points. So women have a very, very high participation rate. And intuitively, I thought, well, it could be that the child tax may have shrunk as a consequence of this. So, so what I do what I'll be doing is the following. So what you have here is I have all the births in Quebec from 2006 to today. That's 1.4 million births. And I know if the parents are heterosexual couples, female couples, or married couples. So that's what it is. So what I did here was run a simple difference staggered estimate of the change in income for mothers before and after birth. And what you see is there's a big dip in their income following birth, which is exactly what we observe everywhere in the world. It's about $10,000, $12,000, which is more or less 20%, which is exactly what we find in other countries. And you see that participation rate decrease, and it never picks up again. Okay, so it decreased by 10 to 15 percentage points following birth, and this drives the income downwards. Okay, now if I look at fathers, fathers lose income as well. So fathers following birth, they will lose anywhere between $8,000, $10,000, which is less than women, than mothers, but they too will have a dip in their participation rates following birth, and that participation rate never goes up again. So what we can do with the data, this is men in general and women in general. So what we can do is merge them and see how the difference between spouses change. And what we find is that, well, if you match couples, you'll see that following birth, the difference between mother and father's income increases following birth by about $3,000. So the average treatment effect is $3,000. And if you divide this by the pre-birth income of the mother, this is barely 10%. So the child tax is the difference between what the mother loses relative to that of the father. And if you look at this is very low. It's lower than what you find in, say, Sweden, Norway, or Finland, or Denmark. Okay, it's very low. And it was mentioned this morning, but the countries that have the highest child tax is Germany and Austria, then Anglo-Saxon countries like US and England, and then Scandinavian countries have the lowest child tax. But we have a smaller child tax yet. Okay, so again, we don't know why that is. I'm not saying it's because of the policies. I'm not saying this. But what we can do then is look at female couples. So we have over 3,600 female couples one of the spouses gave birth during the same period. And what you do find is that the biological mother who gave birth loses 11,340, which is, if we can back up a bit, well, pretty much the same as a female in a heterosexual couple. Now, if you look at the non-biological mother, she loses $5,000 on average over the course of over a period of 7 years following birth, which is biological mother, fathers. So fathers in heterosexual couples lose on average 3,000, and this doesn't work. $5,000. It's quite similar. And if you look at the consequence, if you match mothers together, and what you find is that, again, the discrepancy between income once the child is born increases pretty much the same as in heterosexual couples. Finally, what I do in the paper is I look at couples who adopt a child. There's no birth, because the argument is the difference between whatever the mother loses, perhaps is due to the fact that there's a maternity, there's the loss of capital, or there are preferences, social norms. So by comparing heterosexual couples with female couples, with couples who adopt a child, we're basically removing the maternity consequence. You do find the exact same thing in adopting couples. So the question is, what's driving this? But it's always small. So by all international comparison, the child tax in Quebec is quite small relative to what we find in other countries. So, before I say thank you, so what we're working on right now, we also have male couples, but we have much fewer observations. But if we do the same exercise, although we do lose a lot of statistical power, we do basically find the same thing. So the question is, what is driving this? And it's not the policies that we implement, because all of this is conditional on a policy. So daycare, subsidized daycare, parental leave, it's all in the data. So I don't have a before and after that. So I just have to look at this. But by comparing different household composition, then we can actually infer something about preferences, comparative advantage, social norms, etc., etc. So here, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And I was told that we should squeeze.
Oh, I don't mind.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So thank you very much. This was a very exciting day. I learned so much. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this conference. Every paper was really outstanding, and I'm really enjoying the experience. So what I'm going to talk to you about is some ideas on how to fight wage inequality. So I'm going to focus on a particular type of inequality, and fighting poverty. So small topics. No, I'm joking. And these are ideas from research, and for me, I'm not representing the ideas of the World Bank. So one thing that I think is commonly thought is that inequality is increasing everywhere. This is not true. Inequality is falling in many places. It has fallen a lot in Brazil, and in Latin America overall in the early 2000s. In the US, it has been falling since COVID. And in Portugal, my country, we also had a strong rise in inequality, followed by a reduction in inequality. So first thing that I want to say is that inequality is not rising everywhere. And maybe we can learn from the countries where inequality has been falling on why this happens, to have a better understanding of the policy tools. And when we think about this issue, as researchers, kind of think about the usual AKM model. So where we are thinking that the job component has kind of three parts to it. One that has to do with workers. Your workers that are more educated are likely to make more money, their ability, their motivation, their preferences. So this was kind of the initial idea. And in this sense, you were thinking about policy that would improve education, improve the quality of services as the main tools to reduce inequality. These policies are important, there's no doubt. But what the literature has shown is that when you think about wages, you also have to think about firms. Larger firms tend to pay higher wages, more productive firms tend to pay higher wages, etc. And the match between workers and firms. So when we think about the variance of wages, in most countries, what we get is that about 20% of the changes in the variance of wages, so changes in inequality, are due to firm characteristics. So if we are completely disregarding the firm side, we are, not acting on a large part of the causes of the changes. What I mean is that, for example, in Portugal, as time went by, managers at McKinsey that are from the same gender, same level of education, ability, etc., compared with a manager at McDonald's, now they make much more similar wages than before. And then the question starts being why? And there's many people argue that has to do to a large extent, to do with minimum wage policies, and they have a bite. But in terms of firms,
what is interesting to see is that, you know, things like the degree of imperfect competition on labor markets and the change in imperfect competition is really important. So if you think about it, when you have a change in inequality from the firm side, you could think about the situation where, you know, all workers look pretty much the same. The characteristics of workers are, the distribution of their characteristics are the same. Firms, the distribution of firm characteristics is about the same, but the pass-through, the share of the firm premium that is passed to workers in the form of wages has changed. And one of the drivers of this change can be a change in competition. In this sense, policies that increase the level of competition in labor markets could reduce inequality. And this seems to be the case in countries like Portugal. So this is kind of the firm side. And then there's the macro side. Like I showed you this morning, macroeconomic shocks matter. Crises do change to a large extent inequality. And this is something that we should, you know, take into consideration. So my call here is more and more from the research, we are understanding that the policy mix needs to extend to account for these factors, firm policies, and also the effects of macroeconomic shocks. So in the policy mix, we should take them into consideration, also considering all the other policies that we spoke about. Okay, so this was poverty. Now, this was inequality. Now turning to poverty, and we see that, you know, a big concern about inequality is this persistence in poverty, like Marie showed. And this is a big problem because it's really what we want to raise is the bottom. We want to reduce inequality by raising the bottom so the opportunities spread. So what is being done differently, in my opinion? Many countries have been adopting what we call inclusion strategies for extreme poor. What do we mean by this? Is that, you know, they are adopting in many cases, especially in developed countries, or have adopted minimum income schemes, but they are more and more putting in these schemes this social inclusion component. What is meant is that, you know, it's kind of an integrated approach. You don't just give the income, but you also give tools so the very poor have an easier time in integrating in the labor markets. If you think about it, many people who are, you know, in deep poverty, they are not immediately employable in the sense of an employment service, public employment service. They often they have, like, you know, several causes of their problem, and they should be tackled. The first move is not always, let's get a job for this person. And this is something that increasingly countries are doing more and more. And this means going, you know, in the entry of, you know, every important poverty program, you have a social worker who kind of sees the person in this holistic manner and doesn't just consider the income deprivation, but kind of considers, how can I tool this person to have an insertion in the labor markets, even if it is not immediate. So another important point that I think is changing in terms of policy is that I think most people were convinced that, you know, investments in childhood are really important. They have very high returns in terms of human capital formation. These returns decrease as you age. But I think more and more we are also reflecting on the fact that a lot of human capital, even in developing countries, is formed while you are in adult age in the labor markets. Returns to experience exist even in developing countries, even among unskilled workers. They are smaller, but they do exist. And a large part of this accumulation that exists in adult age is very important for your possibilities of exiting poverty. And the policies to build human capital here in working age are very different from those here. So here again, my call is to kind of amplify the menu of policies. And this slide is kind of a third point. and I think we'll like this point, is that in terms of evaluation culture of the social policies, we are more and more sophisticated, and I think we are more and more seeing a strong government ownership of these evaluations, but many countries have different approaches. Here I'm going to tell you the story of Spain and Italy. Spain has kind of a bottom-up approach of the idea is that you have pilots testing different productive inclusion strategies for the poor, very innovative programs. You do RCTs in this case, and then you test innovations in a kind of in partnerships between academics and policymakers. And then you put forward the results in a very serious manner, and you then decide which ones you scale up. Here, again, there has been a strong emphasis on these promotion policies, and these labor insertion, entrepreneurship are clearly in the menu. They also put a lot of emphasis on personalized psychosocial support, and this is an area that is really harder to implement, to do it right, and they are, doing several impact evaluations on this. They do put a lot of emphasis also on demand side constraints. These are constraints that happen in many countries. In many countries, we have minimum income, but then we have a very low take-up. It's not the existence that matters for a big reduction in poverty, is whether people do receive this support, and this support is sufficiently high to get people out of poverty. So they are testing several innovations on these. And they did a very interesting partnership between local and international academics in designing and doing the evaluations. They focus in terms of supply side on trusted organizations, a focus on quality, and they do put a lot of emphasis in costing and cost effectiveness of the different programs. This is the Spanish approach and is very innovative. In Italy, they have a more system approach and kind of a central approach. So they took longer in a way to establish the system, but they are evaluating as a whole the system. It's not the pilot idea, but is more, let's use administrative data, integrating all the information systems, and that let's institutionalize from the beginning a system that can always be evaluated using this type of data. They have similar ingredients to some extent as the Spanish ones in terms of the importance of case management, social workers, and they have this feature where there is kind of a conditionality is an agency of beneficiaries. So there is the assigning of an inclusion path where the beneficiaries commit to this path and the government commits to provide the services. They have been doing a lot of tailoring and integration and this emphasis on the information systems. Now, the fourth and last, I think, is this challenge of welfare measurement and aggregation and scaling up. And you do see this in Spain versus Italy. So a first point is, I think most people would agree that, we should go beyond the usual measures of impact or of income to assess the effects of policies on the poor. We should consider well-being measures. So going to more multidimensional welfare measure, then there's this hard point of how do we agree on the measure? How do we measure it the same way everywhere? When we come to issues of mental health, subjective well-being aspirations, we have to have a lot of conversations on common instruments to capture these type of aspects. And in terms of aggregations, many governments like the dashboard approach, counting interventions, kind of having big numbers of objectives to then think if they are going towards that direction or not, going more towards longitudinal tracking of people. Now, all this is great, but the disaggregation in terms of programs is kind of hard because sometimes, implementing a small pilot of training that is in pristine order done by the best institution in the country when there are few people having that profile, definitely works. When you scale this up to 1 million people, you have a problem. So, you know, the literature and kind of the debate in international institutions has been a lot on what's the minimum package that I have to provide to make this work at scale. It's not a boutique hotel. Is, you know, at scale, how can this work with the minimum cost, so it's cost effective, and also kind of an implementation difficulty that is feasible for countries that are medium and low income. So this is kind of an important idea, and these were the 4 main points that I wanted to leave you in. So on inequality, raising, you know, expanding the agenda, the menu of policies. On poverty, these innovations that you know, disaggregation effects, thinking about welfare, evaluating differently with more ownership from the government, and more this idea of productive inclusion, thinking about labor market insertion and social workers as being key people to the poverty reduction programs. Thank you.
It was impressive how much ground you all covered in very little time. So yeah, we can open up to questions now. I would have questions, but I would prefer if, you know, panel members have questions for each other, or the audience has questions. So let's see if anybody has a question. You may direct that to people, to the panel as a whole.
I have a question for Marie. My first question is for her, and then I'll have one for Joana. And I wrote it down because it's a little bit. So if the income range, intergenerational range, were the same in the mid-80s as they were in the mid-60s, so you showed that they were increasing a little bit, the inequality in the rank to ranks. Would the income of lower quintile, of the lowest quintile, be higher or lower?
Okay.
So I'm
Sorry.
not talking about the range.
I have to say, Marcel was my professor when I was in college, so I feel like I'm back in class, and then there's a right or wrong answer. Wait, can you repeat the question?
So the question is it the rank that matters, or is it the level at which the lower quintile can reach because of the inequality that has been increasing?
Right. Okay. Okay. The results that I've shown were based on ranks.
Yeah.
And so if you're more likely or less likely to move from one rank to the other, it means that somebody else, it's all relative. And so it means that somebody else is less or more likely to move as well. And the threshold to be in that bottom quintile, let's say, can move over time. It's computed within a birth year. So that's also something that might move. It doesn't say anything about absolute poverty, because it's not an absolute level, it's a relative level. That said, then I forgot what the exact wording of your question was, but that's why you wrote it down.
As usual, as you know, I wasn't always understanding the questions I was asking. But no, I'm talking about, yeah, inequality in terms of rank, but maybe the increase in the rank inequality is a factor that moves up the income level of all quintiles. So that's kind of my question.
All right. So what I have not shown is that we've also looked at, and it's something also that's been mentioned today, the Gatsby curve. So the relationship between income inequality and income mobility in the sense of intergenerational transmission. And specifically what we've looked at is inequality in the parental income distribution. And what we see in the time period that we look at, because it's that period where income inequality was increasing overall in Canada, it's in that 80s, 90s time frame. So we do see that parental income inequality is increasing. We also see that transmission is increasing, so mobility is decreasing. And so to make to reuse a figure of speech that's been used before, If you think of the income distribution as a ladder, rising income inequality means the rungs of the ladder are further apart. What we also see is that going from one rung to the other, so climbing up that ladder has become harder as the rungs have become more spread out, further apart. That said, just by saying everything that I've said, I did not say anything about the levels. So it could be that everybody's income is rising, but that the tops are rising way more. It could also be that the bottom is falling. And so it doesn't mean that there's a tide that rises everybody, even if some people are higher up.
Okay.
So I pass.
Get an age.
Just like back in the day.
But, and that brings me to the question I would ask Joana about, and the four of you have been talking a lot about income or wealth, but mainly income inequalities. What about consumption inequalities? Because income is fine, but what really determines the well-being of the household is what the household consumes. Now, there are many goods that are consumed for which the household doesn't pay. So you don't need income to consume those goods. And that's what is called the social transfers in kind that governments produce and that NPISH are the not-for-profit institutions serving households. You were talking about those institutions that are kind of civil organization, but that are producing goods and services, including in terms of reinsertion in the labor market and so on, for which the individuals do not pay. They are free, but they are part of their consumption. And there is a research program at the OECD about measuring those social transfers in kind. Now, social transfers in kind, according to Statistics Canada, represent about 80% of the adjusted disposable income of the lowest quintile, which is therefore a major part of their consumption. But there is no expenditure, okay? So there's no income. You don't need income. And I was wondering if, I don't remember exactly what I was going to ask you, but that when you talked about reinsertion and services, helping people to enter the labor force or re-enter the labor force after some difficult time, let's say they may have, these are services that people are not going to pay for in general. Either they're provided by government services or by NPISH, the not-for-profit institutions. And therefore, they are now in Canada, the inequality of consumption have been going down significantly over the last 25 years. And this is the period for which we have data on the distribution of the social transfers in kind by households and therefore by quintile. We're not talking about military services or things like that. That are kind. We don't know exactly who is benefiting from those, but education is certainly something that households are consuming, and we know which households are consuming education services. There are households with children, basically. So there are education. I don't want to take too much time, but education budgets are distributed across households on the basis of the number of children of school age, basically, in Canada. And when you look at those and you add that the value of that consumption to the income, let's say, of the household, inequalities have been going down significantly over the last 25 years, and probably for a much longer period of time, but we don't have data on that. And I was wondering, what are your reaction to of taking into account the social transfers in kind rather than in money?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's what I meant by the reduction in the quality of social services. So what I mean is, in the ideal society, you know, there are big gains to be made in poverty and inequality through expansions in education, but also through the quality of public services, like that you could monetize. If at the limit, if the public services are so bad that, you know, to survive in a hospital, you have to go to the private hospital and you cannot pay this bill because you're too poor for that, that's the kind of inequality that really worries me. The same for a school. If you are, and this happens in many countries, if you are going to the public school and you don't learn, and the only way to learn is to go to a private school that you cannot afford, that's the kind of inequality that worries me. And that's why, you know, as I see in many countries around the world, a decline in the quality of the public services, of education, of health, I do worry about you know, what it will do to poverty reduction, what it will do to outcomes, inequality outcomes that we really care. My point was, in addition to that, these programs that they have, they are kind of assuming, you know, Italian and Spanish standards for education and health, which are different from, you know, very low income countries. And they are saying, if I just give the income, will I make it? And the answer from the literature is that you'll make progress, but you will not be able to take the extreme poor to a large extent from poverty. Why? Because, you know, about 80%, that's the number for developing countries, of your income is made by your wages, even more among the poor. And you're right, the ideal data will be consumption data, but we don't have that for many developing countries. We do have income, which is easier in a way to collect, but not so much consumption. But in that sense, I fully agree with you. I think a very important way to reduce inequality is to, you know, high quality education and health. And also in this case, they are less expensive. So here the transfer will be smaller. You know, if you think about Bolsa Familia program, the welfare program in Brazil, it costs, now they expanded much more, but in steady state, it costs about 0.6% of GDP. You know, it's a lot of money for the poor person, but not a large amount economy-wide. So this is not where the big, it's going to be very important for the poor's income, but not for, you know, in the bigger scheme. But education, certainly, just because private schools are expensive, just because private hospitals are expensive. And I fully agree with you. I think that's super important. What I was saying is that in addition to that, you will need also to think about the firm side. These increases that are happening in many countries in monopoly power in the labor markets, where then, you know, this pass through the gains from working in a good firm don't arrive to the workers. That's kind of an additional item, or the impact of macro shocks that, as I showed in the morning, are not being compensated at the worker level. So it's kind of additional items, but definitely education and the quality of public provided education and health are the secret for the countries that have the lowest levels of inequality that I'm very conscious about.
I have a question related to aging and policy, so it's really for Andrew. So as it's well documented that aging challenges the solvency of a typical pay-as-you-go pension system. And also you have shown that the elder employment, and you also show some option to raise the elder employment. So I'm wondering if raising elder employment can be a potential, or to what extent be a good solution to this insolvency.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, with that very first graph that I showed in my presentation before, you know, showed the effects of the burden. I mean, that was specifically from, you know, inactivity, workers being inactive, which is obviously a particular problem. But yeah, I mean, I think our argument is that by improving employment, then at older ages, then that can help with potential insolvency issues, budget problems that governments are going to face. And so, you know, there's a wide range of things that governments can do and employers can do to try and improve employment rates. You know, in terms of improving training, improving job quality, improving health, for example, so that workers can actually stay in employment for longer. I mean, but I mean, I don't. Yeah, I mean, the graph I showed, you know, gives some simulations as to what could happen in terms of GDP. I mean, we haven't looked specifically at sort of the solvency of pension systems, or at least not in my team. I'm not sure the pensions team has particularly got any recent work on that either, but I'm not sure.
And can I piggyback on her intervention? No, I didn't want to talk about intergenerational transmission because I thought it was already enough papers on this, but I wrote a piece of paper a couple of years ago, which is pretty much what you did with Norway. And I looked at intragenerational transmission or mobility. And my interest was from all those policies that I mentioned here in Quebec, whether they actually contributed to lifting people in terms of mobility. And we know that in Quebec, the poverty rate is lower than other provinces in Canada. But what we find also is that all those policies didn't do anything in terms of mobility. So they help people in terms of poverty, raise their income, but they did nothing in terms of mobility. So they remain stuck in the bottom no matter what. And so they had no effect whatsoever on the mobility. So they help reduce poverty, but they don't help increase mobility. And the downward mobility in Quebec is a bit smaller than what it is elsewhere, but the upward mobility is also lower. So we have a different type of dynamics in this province, which could be due to all kinds of things. But certainly the public policies that we've been implementing for the past 20 or 35 years or so, they didn't change anything in terms of mobility. So we have to look at somewhere else to understand why it is that we're both have lower downward mobility and lower upward mobility. We're sort of stuck in the same place, although those policies did help raise the bottom level, but didn't do anything in terms of mobility. But I thought there were already enough papers on this today, so I didn't want to bother.
Actually, I have a question that relates a bit to that, but I think there are several of you who could speak to that. So I think, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, so Matthias Döpke and Fabrizio Zeligotti published this book about economics and the family, which is quite interesting if you have kids. And one of the arguments they made is that parents invest a lot of time in their kids, right? And that was, we saw in Hugo's talk that it was important, and I thought about that there. And they argue that in countries where there's more inequality or maybe more concentrated top incomes, I'm not sure that parents like invest extra much time in their kids. And that of course would have implications for what kind of school systems are effective, and it would have implications for intergenerational mobility. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts related to that, and that would maybe have implications for like Quebec over time or comparisons to other places.
Well, if I may also go. The subsidized daycare program that we introduced 30 years ago, its main aim was to help children from poor families have access to public good daycare and so on and so forth. And what you find is that poor mothers or poor households hardly take any parental leave. And why is that? Because they can't afford to, they earn too little. And because the replacement rate is only about 50% or 70%, but 70% of nothing is nothing. And very high top income individuals don't take any, they rather invest in either in private daycare, private services, or at the lower bottom, what they do is, well, they make use of the daycare system because it's heavily subsidized, and they don't take much parental leave, either parents. So there's a sort of a hole in the because the problem with the goal of subsidized daycare and parental leave is to give access to leave so for mothers and fathers, and the behavior is totally different whether you're poor, whether you're rich. And so it's more or less for the middle income household as opposed to those at either end of the so the poor don't really benefit from this. the rich either, because they can't afford to lose too much money by being away from the labor market too long. So it's a weird, it has very different implications whether you're poor or rich, but the consequences are the same. And the poor households actually don't take much parental leave, and they resort to daycares, and that's a service that they actually use. So it's a sort of a substitute for not taking holiday parental leave. They take. So I don't know if you want to add something to this.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question and important point to keep in mind when you're trying to design a policy, because a little bit as we've seen before, sometimes what will happen at the level of the government, policy-wise, might be undone by what parents will do, and vice versa, right? And so the way you mentioned it reminds me, and there's no lack of evidence for the different ways parents invest in their kids. Many papers have been written, but you know, strikingly in the news, you know, a few years ago when you had all the scandals in the US of parents basically paying for their kids to get in very selective schools. It's just an example, if it's an extreme example, but it's an example of the way parents invest in their kids. And I think it goes back to the earlier, you know, the Becker models of where you invest in your kid, and you can invest through money, you can invest through time. And what you'll see is when the rewards of, in this case, higher education and getting into a selective school is very high, where you're going to have parents that are very motivated, that will, you know, put in a lot of resources. And what this creates is obviously situations where whatever the government might want to do in terms of equalizing, better subsidizing public schools might be undone by what the parents will do. And we just have to think about these things. And I think the best thing we can do is, you know, think about all the different mechanisms and document them and understand what happens in those kind of cases, because it might, you might suggest a policy that might be completely undone by what the parents will do. It's very interesting.
Can I add a
Yep.
thought? So, so I really think this idea of quality childcare is really important. And in developing countries, we are so far from full coverage, and 50% coverage. We are really far from that. So, so that's kind of a very important goal. But it's kind of broader than that. If you think about our lives, until we are about 6 years old, parents decide everything. They decide which school we attend. They decide the kids with whom we play, the type of toys, the books. They decide everything. So the family is really, really important. And more, you know, parenting programs kind of emphasizing the importance of reading to kids, and this kind of creating this good environment at home and at the childcare is being perceived as being very, very important. Even vaccinations, even going to the doctor, it's your parents who decide that. Is almost scary for us to want parents and the responsibility we have, no? So the family is everything until I think in a very important stage of your life. So whenever you're thinking about, you know, policies to promote human capital and to promote these less poverty and better inequality outcomes, you really have to think about family as an important arena. As well as neighborhoods. We saw also the importance of your peers and the place where you are. And then, you know, the firms, this idea of your work environment, which is also very important. But the family needs to be kind of not just thought about, needs to be an action point. Like several policies should target directly families and their and help them do better in terms of their human capital.
And one thing that hasn't been mentioned today is the assortative matching.
Mm-hmm.
More and more spouses resemble one another. And so part of the inequity between what that you observe in the data is due to the fact that households, rich spouses get to stick together and poorer ones. So if you look at the data, what you find is a lot of inequity, but in fact, it's driven by the heterogeneity between rich households and poor households, and with assortative matching within each. So it used to be that there was not so much assortative matching, say 20, 25 years ago. Nowadays, it's the case. And there's been a lot of papers written on this, and it's a big problem, way more important than before. So part of what we observe today is due to this and to assortative matching. And this has not been addressed today, but it's a very important issue.
For the next workshop.
Yes.